Suburbia. The land of freshly mowed lawns, nosy neighbors, and the occasional lunatic who thinks they're the emperor of asphalt. I had no strong opinions about my neighborhood, until Karen decided that she was the second coming of Napoleon. It all started on a chilly Monday morning. I was sipping my coffee on my porch, enjoying the simple pleasure of watching my car peacefully occupying its usual parking spot in front of my house. That's when Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, stormed onto the scene, clipboard in hand and a smug grin plastered on her face. "Good morning, neighbors," she called out in that sickly sweet tone that always carried the underlying threat of a new set of ridiculous rules. "I have an important announcement regarding parking in the neighborhood." Oh no. A few of us drifted closer, exchanging wary glances. Old Mr. Harrison, who had lived here since the 80s, sighed dramatically. Linda, a single mom, rolled her eyes so hard I thought she might sprain something. And then there was me, standing there with my coffee, already predicting the storm that was about to hit. Karen cleared her throat and smiled, the way a shark does when it sees a school of fish with a broken fin. "As of today," she declared, "all street parking spaces in the neighborhood are officially under HOA jurisdiction. If you wish to park your vehicle on the street, you'll be required to pay a monthly fee of $50 per space." Silence. Then chaos. "What? That's ridiculous." Linda practically choked. "That's not how property works," Mr. Harrison said, shaking his head. I took a slow sip of my coffee and glanced at Karen. "Let me guess. You've already got some little orange violation slips printed and ready to go." Karen beamed at me. "Oh, I absolutely do. And if I catch any of you parking without a permit, there will be a $200 fine. I've already drafted the notices." She proudly waved a stack of papers. Now, this was where things got interesting. See, Karen had a lot of things: an inflated sense of self-importance, a deeply misplaced sense of authority, but what she did not have was any legal right to do this. "Karen," I said slowly, "you do realize that these are public roads, right? They belong to the city. They're not HOA property." Karen scoffed. "The HOA has a right to manage the neighborhood. We decided that the streets would be better regulated under our authority. It's for order. You all have to obey me." The collective outrage only grew. "I didn't sign anything agreeing to this," someone yelled. "You can't just charge people for parking in front of their own house," another added. Karen smirked. "Oh, but I can." That's when my neighbor James, a corporate lawyer with the patience of a saint and the legal knowledge of 1,000 angry judges, spoke up. He adjusted his glasses, took a step forward, and smiled the kind of smile that made opposing counsel break into a cold sweat. "Karen," James said in the most polite, deadly voice imaginable, "why don't you send me a copy of this new policy? I'd love to review it." Karen hesitated. Just for a moment. Just long enough for me to see the flicker of "oh no" in her eyes. I grinned. This was about to get good. Karen hesitated, her grip tightening around the clipboard like it was the One Ring and James was Frodo marching straight to Mount Doom. "Oh, she stammered, clearly thrown off by his request. "I'll have the documents ready soon. But that doesn't change the fact that the HOA has spoken. You all need to start paying the fee immediately." James gave her a pleasant, lawyerly smile. "Right. So here's the thing, Karen. If you can't provide the documentation proving that the HOA actually owns the roads, then your little policy isn't worth the paper it's printed on." Karen's face went through several emotions: anger, frustration, mild panic, but she finally settled on her go-to defense: blatant denial. "You're all just resisting because you don't like change," she snapped. "Well, tough. I'll be enforcing this with or without your cooperation." And with that, she spun and marched back to her house, presumably to cackle over her imaginary HOA empire. The second she was out of earshot, the entire street erupted. "This woman has lost it," Linda muttered. "I've lived here for 40 years, Mr. Harrison grumbled. "I am not paying a dime to park in front of my own damn house." James sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "All right, I'll look into this. But I can already tell you, it's nonsense. The HOA has no jurisdiction over public streets. So what do we do? Someone asked. I took another sip of my coffee, considering the options. For now, we ignore her. Won't she start handing out fake fines? Oh, definitely, I nodded. But if we play this right, we can make sure Karen's little reign of terror backfires spectacularly. James nodded. Give me a day to gather some paperwork. I have a strong suspicion the city's going to have a thing or two to say about this. And just like that, the resistance was formed. Sure enough, by the next morning, Karen had kicked her campaign into overdrive. I stepped outside to find a bright orange violation notice taped to my windshield. In Comic Sans. Illegal parking, HOA. Policy violation. Fine, $200. Due immediately. At the bottom, she'd added in bold. No exceptions. Non-payment may result in vehicle towing. I blinked. Then burst out laughing. Looks like she got busy last night, Linda said, walking over with her own ticket. I found mine tucked into my wipers. How official of her. Mr. Harrison stepped outside, holding 4 tickets like he just won a very stupid lottery. She double-fined me for obstruction of community order and disregarding HOA authority, he said, shaking his head. Twice. Classic Karen, I muttered, throwing everything at the wall and hoping something sticks. The best part? The tickets had 0 legal backing. She had no city approval, no official permits, just a Karen-fueled dream and a printer with way too much ink. James walked up, grinning. I've got some fun news. He held up a folder. Turns out, not only does the HOA not own the streets, but I also pulled the city zoning records. These roads? 100% public property. The HOA has 0 legal control. Oh, this is going to be good, I said, rubbing my hands together. Now, it was time to turn the tables on Karen. Karen had spent the morning strutting around the neighborhood like a dictator, admiring her newly conquered land. Every time she saw one of her absurd orange citations on someone's car, she gave a satisfied little nod, as if she'd single-handedly restored order to society. Unfortunately for her, the actual law was about to crash her little fantasy. James, our resident legal mastermind, had been making calls all morning. Turns out, the city takes a very dim view of private citizens attempting to enforce non-existent laws. In fact, unauthorized ticketing was a huge violation, something about impersonating an authority, making fraudulent financial claims, and general Karenery. Here's the plan, James said, gathering a few of us in my driveway. We let Karen keep digging her own grave for a little longer. The city officials I spoke to are very interested in her antics, and they'll be sending someone to investigate. Do we tell her? Linda asked. I grinned. Oh, absolutely not. See, people like Karen don't back down when faced with resistance. No, they double down. The more she thought we were ignoring her, the worse she'd get, and that's exactly what we needed. We agreed to play along for a little while, act annoyed, grumble about the fees, but ultimately pretend to be powerless against her authority. Meanwhile, James was compiling every single piece of documentation we needed to shut this circus down. And then, as if the universe itself was rewarding our patience, Karen gave us the golden ticket. By that evening, Karen had apparently decided that fines weren't enough. No, she needed physical control. I came outside to find traffic cones lined up along the street, blocking off sections of parking. And at the very center of it all, Karen stood proudly, watching like a medieval warlord surveying the battlefield. Oh, she's lost it, Mr. Harrison muttered. Karen, what the hell is this? I asked, gesturing at the cones. These, she declared, hands on her hips, are the HOA designated parking zones. Any car parked outside these marked areas will be immediately towed. I exchanged a glance with James, who raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying how spectacularly Karen was digging her own grave. Karen, I said carefully, you can't tow cars off public streets. That's illegal. Karen scoffed. I've already spoken to a towing company. If people refuse to follow the new rules, Their vehicles will be removed at their own expense. Linda gasped. You actually called a tow truck? Karen smiled like a smug cat. Yes. And in fact, I believe the first tow is happening tonight. Oh, this was better than we could have hoped for. James was already typing away on his phone, probably alerting the city that things had escalated. Meanwhile, I took a deep breath and said, Well, Karen, if that's how you want to play it, let's see how this all turns out. Karen smirked, completely unaware that she had just walked straight into our trap. Karen was practically vibrating with excitement as she oversaw her new HOA parking zone, like some kind of traffic overlord. Meanwhile, the rest of us were gathered on our porches, watching the madness unfold like it was the season finale of the worst reality TV show imaginable. Sure enough, just as she had promised, a tow truck rumbled into the neighborhood that evening. Now, I don't know what kind of sweet-talking Karen had done, but the driver looked a little unsure as he stepped out of his truck. He glanced at the row of cones, then back at Karen, who was practically bouncing on her heels. That's the one, she said, pointing at Mr. Harrison's car. I swear, I saw Mr. Harrison age 10 years in that moment. Ma'am, the driver said hesitantly, are you sure? This is a public road. We usually don't tow cars unless the city requests it. Karen's eyes narrowed. The HOA is the authority here, and I am instructing you to remove that vehicle immediately. The guy still looked uncertain, but Karen was waving a folder of fake documents at him so aggressively that he finally sighed and started backing his truck toward Mr. Harrison's car. And that's when James stepped in. Hey buddy, James called out casually, strolling over with his hands in his pockets. Just so you know, if you hook that car up, you're committing unauthorized towing on a public road. The tow truck driver froze. Wait, what? James smiled. It was the kind of smile that lawyers give right before they ruin your day. This street? 100% city property. And I know for a fact that the HOA has no legal authority to claim jurisdiction over it. He pulled out a neatly printed document. I happen to have the official zoning records right here. The tow truck driver blinked, then slowly turned to Karen. Ma'am, do you actually own these streets? Karen, now looking more like a deer in headlights, sputtered, well, the HOA has the right to regulate parking. We all agreed. No, we didn't, I cut in. The tow truck driver sighed and rubbed his temples. Lady, I'm not getting caught up in this. If I tow this car and it turns out you don't have the right to do this, I'm the one on the hook for legal trouble. Karen turned red. But. James clapped a hand on the driver's shoulder. Tell you what, you don't have to figure this out. Let's get someone who can. I just got off the phone with the city's zoning office. They're sending someone over. Should be here in about, he checked his watch, 10 minutes. I have never seen someone's soul leave their body so quickly. Karen's mouth flapped open and closed, but no sound came out. The tow truck driver, now visibly relieved, hopped back into his truck. Yeah, I'm not sticking around for this, he muttered. Call me when this is legal. And with that, he drove off, leaving Karen alone to face what was coming next. James smiled. Now, let's go have a little chat with the city officials. Karen? She just stood there, completely silent. For the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. Karen stood in the middle of the street, looking like someone had just told her that HOA bylaws weren't actually part of the U.S. Constitution. 10 minutes later, a city official arrived in a very official-looking vehicle, stepping out with the kind of exasperation that only comes from years of dealing with suburban lunatics who think they own the world. The official, Mr. Carter, surveyed the scene with a deep sigh. All right, he said, pulling out a clipboard. Who wants to tell me why I got a report that someone's trying to enforce illegal parking restrictions on public property? Karen, being Karen, immediately snapped back to life. Finally, she huffed, marching up to Mr. Carter. I'm so glad you're here. These people are refusing to obey HOA rules, and we need your help enforcing proper community order. Mr. Carter looked at her like she had just told him the moon was made of cheese. Ma'am, I think you misunderstand why I'm here. Karen puffed up, hands on her hips. The HOA has decided that street parking should be regulated. We have imposed a small fee for parking, but some people are resisting change. A small fee? I echoed. $200 fines, Karen. She ignored me. Mr. Carter raised an eyebrow. And who gave you the authority to charge people to park on public streets? Karen blinked. The HOA. The HOA, Mr. Carter cut in, already shaking his head, does not have authority over public roads. The city maintains jurisdiction over these streets. If you wanted to enforce any kind of permit system, you would need approval from the city, which, he flipped through a few pages on his clipboard, you never applied for. Karen's confident smirk started to flicker. Well, she stammered, we just assumed that the HOA writes. You assumed wrong, Mr. Carter said flatly. You cannot create fake citations. You cannot threaten people with towing their vehicles. And you definitely cannot demand that residents pay fees for a service that doesn't legally exist. Karen's face was cycling through all 5 stages of grief. But I had to do something. People were parking wherever they wanted. That's because it's a public road, Karen, I said, grinning. That's kinda how roads work. Mr. Carter sighed and turned to the rest of us. Has she actually issued fines? Oh yeah, Linda said, holding up her bright orange ticket like it was evidence in a murder trial. She even printed them in Comic Sans. Mr. Carter grimaced like he'd just smelled something rotten. All right, he said, rubbing his temples, here's what's going to happen. Every single fine Karen has issued is null and void. If she, or anyone from the HOA, tries to enforce any part of this parking rule again, the city will officially be issuing fines. For the residents? Karen asked hopefully. Mr. Carter's gaze turned icy. No, ma'am. For you. A delightful hush fell over the crowd. Karen sputtered. But. James smirked and pulled out a very thick folder of legal paperwork. I've also taken the liberty of filing a formal complaint against the HOA for misrepresentation and fraudulent enforcement of non-existent rules. Karen's eyes widened in pure horror. You wouldn't. Oh, I absolutely would, James said cheerfully. And I did. Mr. Carter nodded. That complaint is now under city review. And depending on how it plays out, Karen, you and the HOA could be personally liable for any stress or financial burdens caused by these fake fines. Karen's soul was leaving her body. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching the pure panic settle into her face. And that's when Karen, predictably, lost her last shred of sanity. Karen stood there, visibly shaking, her eye twitching like an overworked printer about to jam. You can't do this, she screeched. I was only trying to keep order. This neighborhood needs rules. Mr. Carter, who had clearly dealt with many Karens in his lifetime, sighed. Ma'am, what you did was illegal. The city doesn't take kindly to individuals impersonating authorities and issuing fraudulent fines. Karen's panic was reaching meltdown levels. She spun to the crowd. You're all just ungrateful. I put in so much work to make this community better, and this is how you repay me. You'd rather have chaos. Linda, who had been itching for this moment, crossed her arms. Karen, it's street parking, not the purge. The neighborhood chuckled, and Karen visibly cracked. You think this is funny? You think? Then she whipped out her phone. Fine. If I can't enforce rules, then I'll make sure none of you park here either. Before anyone could react, she stormed to her car, threw open the driver's side door and screeched into reverse, blocking the entire street. We all froze. No way, James murmured, rubbing his temples. Oh, she's actually lost it, I whispered. Karen jumped out of her car, arms folded, standing in front of it like some kind of deranged parking deity. No one is parking on this street until you all agree to the new rules, she shrieked. The whole neighborhood was frozen in dead silence, and only Mr. Carter picked up his phone with a sigh and called someone back. Just a few minutes passed, and then, in the distance, A faint sound. A very distinct beeping noise. Linda gasped. Is that? James chuckled darkly. Oh, this is poetic justice. Karen, still caught up in her tantrum, didn't seem to notice the tow truck rolling down the street. The real one. Summoned by the karma. And it was headed straight for her illegally parked car. The moment Karen heard the beep 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 of the tow truck backing up, her entire body stiffened. It was as if, for the first time in her life, she realized that actions have consequences. Mr. Carter, ever the professional, simply crossed his arms and turned to the driver. That's the vehicle illegally blocking public access. The tow truck driver, a burly man with zero patience for nonsense, gave a single nod. Got it. Karen screeched. No. You can't tow my car. I'm the one enforcing the rules. She lunged for her driver's seat, but James was faster. Karen, he said smoothly, stepping in front of her, you personally called a towing company to try and tow Mr. Harrison's car off this exact road, claiming it was violating HOA regulations. By your own logic, a car breaking the rules gets towed. No exceptions. Karen's face turned so red I thought she might explode. But this is different. Nope. Linda popped her gum loudly. It's literally the same thing. By now, the tow truck driver had already hooked both front wheels of Karen's car onto the rig. He gave a sharp whistle. You the owner, lady? Karen, now visibly trembling, nodded rapidly. Yes. And I demand you unhook my car this instant. The tow truck driver shrugged. Sorry, lady. I got a direct request from city enforcement. Your car's blocking public access. It's going to impound. Karen let out a noise that I can only describe as a dying possum mixed with a banshee's wail. She turned back to Mr. Carter. You can't do this. I'll fight this in court. I'll get the HOA lawyers involved. Mr. Carter arched an eyebrow. Ma'am, the HOA doesn't have lawyers. And even if they did, you personally are being cited for obstructing a public roadway. You'll need to pay the impound fees and the fine before you get your vehicle back. Karen went pale. Fine? What fine? James grinned. Oh, didn't you hear? Blocking public roads comes with a $500 city violation fee. Karen made a wheezing noise. Mr. Harrison cackled. Oh, this is better than cable. The tow truck driver gave the final signal, and with a smooth, satisfying whir, Karen's car was lifted completely off the ground. Wait, she ran after it as it rolled down the street. I'll get you all removed from the HOA. I'm in charge here. You can't. And then, in a moment of sheer cinematic perfection, she tripped, fell flat on her face, and her own HOA violation tickets scattered all around her like confetti. The neighborhood? Dead silent. Then, Mr. Harrison started clapping. Slowly, deliberately, and then one by one, everyone else joined in. Karen just sat there, disheveled, humiliated, and watching as her precious car, disappeared down the street, heading straight for impound. Justice. Karen sat there, frozen in shock, as the tow truck disappeared into the distance. Her humiliation was absolute. The entire neighborhood had just witnessed her grand plan implode spectacularly. But we weren't done yet. Mr. Carter, ever the professional, cleared his throat. Now that that's settled, let's talk about next steps. Karen groaned from the ground. Next steps. Oh yes, James said, adjusting his glasses with entirely too much enjoyment. The city is launching a formal investigation into your actions as HOA president. See, issuing fake fines? Attempting to extort residents? Trying to enforce unauthorized policies? That's a big no-no. Karen bolted upright. But I was just trying to bring order. James smiled. And in doing so, you broke about a dozen actual laws. Mr. Carter nodded. You'll be receiving an official notice soon, but in the meantime, the city is issuing a cease and desist order on all HOA Enforced parking policies. Karen's mouth fell open. A cease and desist. That means, I said cheerfully, no more fake fines, no more cones, no more threatening to tow cars. Linda popped her gum. Basically, you're done, Karen. Karen sputtered, looking around desperately for someone, anyone to back her up. But the crowd? Silent. Mr. Harrison finally stepped forward. I think it's time we talk about something else, too. Oh. Mr. Carter asked. The HOA board, Mr. Harrison said, giving Karen a pointed look. Specifically, the fact that none of us actually voted her in. Karen blanched. That's not true. James smirked. Actually, it is. I took the liberty of reviewing the HOA bylaws. He held up a very thick document. And funny enough, the board is supposed to hold annual elections. The crowd murmured. Some neighbors nodded. Mr. Harrison turned back to the crowd. I say it's time for a new vote. Who here would like to elect a new HOA board? Hands shot up. Karen made another dying possum noise. You can't just vote me out, she shrieked. James flipped through the bylaws. Actually, we can. Right now. Karen lunged for the document. Let me see that. James effortlessly stepped back. Nope. Let's make it official, I said, crossing my arms. Who here votes to remove Karen as HOA president? Every single hand went up. Except Karen's, of course. Mr. Carter smirked. Well, that seems unanimous. I'll make a note of that in the city's report. Karen let out an actual scream. The reign of Karen? Officially over. Karen looked like she had just been sentenced to life in a maximum security suburb. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The power was gone. You can't do this, she finally shrieked. James, ever the professional, adjusted his glasses. Karen, we already did. Mr. Carter smirked. And, as a city official, I can confirm that it was done legally. The crowd? Absolutely eating this up. Mr. Harrison, enjoying himself far too much, turned to the rest of us. Now, about replacing the HOA board, who wants to volunteer? A few people, including Linda and James, immediately stepped forward. I nominate James, I said, because I'm pretty sure he just single-handedly saved this neighborhood. The crowd cheered. Karen? She looked like she had just swallowed a lemon. But the HOA is my. It's ours, Karen, Linda cut in, arms crossed. You were just playing dictator. Yeah, I added. And now you're impeached. Karen let out a long hissing breath, her face turning all sorts of interesting colors. You'll regret this. James grinned. Karen, I'll regret a lot of things in my life, but this? Not one of them. The newly forming HOA committee immediately started planning ways to fix Karen's mess. First order of business? Refunding every single resident that Karen had scammed. Mr. Carter saw that things were going well and said, well, let's sit down somewhere so I can finish my official part of the paperwork, so I invited everyone to my house. It took us about an hour, and we had almost forgotten about Karen. Because any sane person would have taken the loss and slinked back into the shadows. Not Karen. Nope, she still had one last trick up her sleeve. When we came out, we saw that Karen plastered the entire neighborhood with flyers. They were taped to mailboxes, shoved under doors, and because she's nothing if not dramatic, zip-tied to stop signs. They all said the same thing. You may have won, but you will all pay for your mistake. I will find a way to take back what is mine. This is not over. There was just one big problem. Karen, in her infinite genius, had taped one to Mr. Carter's car. The city official. The same city official who had issued her violations. The same city official who was actively investigating her. When Mr. Carter found the note, sighed dramatically, and simply said, well, that's harassment. Karen was about to have a very bad day. Karen had officially crossed the final uncrossable line. Mr. Carter held the flyer between two fingers, as if it physically offended him. His sigh was the kind of deep, exhausted exhale that only government employees dealing with suburban lunatics can truly master. "Well," he said, looking around. "That's officially harassment. Time to escalate this." Karen, who had been hiding inside her house, must have sensed the shift in the atmosphere. Maybe she saw Mr. Carter pulling out his phone. Maybe she realized that threatening an entire neighborhood in writing wasn't her best moment. Either way, she exploded out of her front door, shrieking, "That isn't harassment. It's a warning." Oh, Karen. Oh, sweet, legally doomed Karen. Mr. Carter, ever the professional, tilted his head. "Ma'am, did you just admit to issuing threats?" Karen froze. Then, as I can only assume in a panic, she ran up and snatched the postcard from his hands and tried to eat it. Yes. She actually tried to eat the evidence. Unfortunately for her, paper isn't a great snack. She started choking almost immediately, hacking and sputtering as she frantically tried to chew through what I assume was the worst breakfast of her life. Mr. Harrison, ever the helpful one, patted her on the back, hard. The soggy remains of the flyer fluttered pathetically to the ground. Mr. Carter, unfazed, took a picture of the now mangled evidence with his phone. "Right," he said, typing something into his notes. "Adding attempted destruction of evidence to the report." Karen, realizing she had just made everything 10 times worse, went into full meltdown mode. "This is a conspiracy," she shrieked. "You're all against me. I'm the real victim here." At that exact moment, 2 uniformed officers pulled up to the scene. Karen froze again. Mr. Carter turned, gave them a polite nod, and gestured toward Karen. "Evening, officers. We've got multiple city violations, harassment complaints, and an attempt to fraudulently enforce non-existent laws. Oh, and she just tried to destroy evidence, by eating it." Karen's soul left her body. The officers looked at each other, clearly trying not to laugh. Then, the taller one turned to Karen. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us." Karen went ballistic. She tried to run. She made it about 3 steps before tripping over her own knocked-over traffic cones and landing flat on her face. The crowd? Absolutely losing it. Mr. Harrison was crying with laughter. Linda had her phone out, recording everything. Even James, usually the picture of restraint, was chuckling under his breath. Karen, realizing she had no way out, collapsed into a heap of screaming outrage. "This is my street," she bellowed one last time. "I am the law here." The officers gently placed her in the back of the squad car. "No, ma'am," the taller one said as he shut the door. "The law is the law." With Karen gone, the HOA underwent a massive cleanup. James, now the official HOA president, rewrote the bylaws to ensure no one could pull another Karen-level stunt again. All of Karen's fake fines? Refunded. The cones? Removed. The city? Officially banned Karen from holding any HOA position ever again. And as for Karen herself? Oh, she came back. A few weeks later, after paying her fines, she slinked back into her house like a raccoon that had been chased off with a broom. But she was never the same. The power had been stripped from her. The HOA no longer answered to her. The city knew her name. And the best part? Her car, after being towed, had mysteriously been given a special parking spot at the impound lot, directly under a tree filled with birds. Justice. Sweet, suburban justice. Thank you for listening this story. Please share in the comments where you are from and whether you liked everything, and see you next time.